When we're using Lajjitaadi Avashtas to find out how the planets are acting with each other and how those planets are impacting various areas of a person's life based on the houses that those Lajjitaadi Avashtas are occurring in, there are two things we have to understand, and that is the power of the planet involved and also the amount of influence the planet involved has. Now, the strength of a planet within the Lajjitaadi Avashtas is based on the planet's dignity. So we figure out the Lajjitaadi Avashtas based on the natural friendship between planets, but we figure out the power of the planet's influence based on the dignity. And the dignity is a combination of the natural friendships between planets and the temporary friendships between planets. And most astrology softwares will figure this out for you. Now, if we look in the upper right-hand corner of this graphic, we'll see a small table, and on the far right there's a column that says DIGN, which stands for dignity. And this is telling us what are the dignity of the planets within this particular birth chart. So you see the Sun is in an enemy dignity, the Moon is in an enemy dignity, Mars is in an enemy dignity, Mercury and Venus are in their own home, Jupiter is in a great friend sign, and Saturn is exalted. Now, when a planet is in its own home, Mula Trikona, or exaltation, that planet is said to be Jagrat, or wide awake, which means the planet is fully conscious, fully able to take care of the affairs of the houses that it rules, fully able to give its results based on its natural energy. It's wide awake. When a planet is in a friend sign, or a neutral Rashi, that planet is said to be sleepy. So it's not quite wide awake, but it's not completely unconscious either, which means that it can still give some results, but it's not as powerful, it's not as able to give its promised results within the birth chart. When a planet is in an enemy sign or debilitation, that planet is said to be sleeping, which means it's unconscious. And when you have a sleeping planet, that planet exists within your life, but is not able to actively produce the things in which the planet represents. Which means that if it's under a bad Lajjitaadi Avashta, it can get severely damaged or even destroyed. And if it's in a good Lajjitaadi Avashta, it won't really do too much to help out that Lajjitaadi Avashta. So looking at this chart, we also need to understand how planets work with aspects. So in a previous video, we talked about the general aspects, about how each planet aspects 7 houses away from itself, but that Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter have special aspects. Now those are very general, and you can get away with them when you don't have a computer program or the time to calculate out the precise mathematical aspects. Now if we look down to the lower left-hand corner of this graphic, we'll see a small table that says Rashi aspected planets. Now this tells us exactly how strong are the influences of the planets upon each other. And the top row, that represents the planet in question, and the left-hand side column where the planets are listed from top to bottom, that shows the planets that are influencing. So for example, if we start with the Moon on the top row and we go down 1, we see that the Sun is influencing the Moon to 9 points of aspect. If we go over to Mars, which is MA, and we go down 1, we see that the Sun is influencing Mars to 39 points of aspect. Now, these are calculated in what's called Virupas. And there are a total of 60 Virupas that you can have in planetary aspect. When you have 60 Virupas, that's a full-on 100% impact upon the planet in question. Below that, it just gradually decreases. So for example, when we look at a planet such as the Moon here, being influenced by the Sun to 9 points, that's a very weak aspect. It'll be noticeable probably within the planet's dasha, but it's not going to be very noticeable at all. It'll be hardly noticeable, actually. And so, for example, the Sun and Moon are friends, and that means that the Sun influencing the Moon like that is delighting the Moon, it's helping the Moon, but it's only giving 9 points of friendly help to that Moon, based on that Lajjitaadi Avashta. So that's good, and that can add up, but it's not enough to be extremely noticeable. Now, the planets we're going to look at in question here are Mercury and Sun. So if we look at the Rashi chart here, and we see that Mercury and Sun together, we know that that is a Lajjitaadi Avashtas for agitation, and that Mercury is getting agitated by the sun. What happens when Mercury is agitated by the sun? Well, our ability to ask for what we want is diminished. Usually early in our life, authority figures have made us feel like what our needs weren't really that important. Also, this can give boundary issues. The person oftentimes doesn't have good boundaries dealing with their friends and so on. But let's figure out just how impactful that's going to be. Anytime a planet is in the same sign, we treat that as though it's a 60-point influence. So it's not going to be on the aspect table there because they're in the same sign. So they're not aspecting, but they're conjunct. And they're conjunct, which gives it that 60-point influence. Now, if we look at the dignity of Mercury, we see that Mercury is in its own home, which means that Mercury is wide awake. Mercury is very strong in this regard. We see that the sun is in an enemy sign. And how are we getting that? We're looking at that upper right-hand table where the dignities are located. So within this Lajjitaadi Avashtas, the sun isn't very powerful to create this sense of agitation towards Mercury, because Mercury is wide awake, it's in its own home, it can take care of itself. And the sun, even though it's still in the same house with Mercury, we'll just say it's like it's asleep on the couch. So when Mercury looks at it, it gets a little bit of that unease, thinking, well, gee, I really can't ask for what I want. But it says, but the sun's asleep, so he's not really going to bother me. So I'm going to ask for what I want anyway. So while there will be that little bit of influence from the sun to Mercury, the fact that the sun is in an enemy sign and sleeping, unconscious, and Mercury is wide awake, that Lajjitaadi Avashtas, while there, is not as strongly felt in regards to its agitation. If we look to Mars and Saturn, we see that Saturn is exalted. It's wide awake. Mars is in an enemy sign. And we know that when Saturn is with any planet by conjunction, Saturn starves that planet. And starvation makes that planet have an extremely hard time to produce what it promises within the chart. And anything that Mars represents has an extremely hard time coming to fruition. Mars is on the couch sleeping because he's unconscious, he's in an enemy sign. And Saturn is wide awake, so he's wide awake to torment this Mars. And Mars can't do anything about it because he's unconscious. So this is a pretty powerfully felt Lajjitaadi Avashtas of starvation from Saturn to Mars in this person's chart. Now, the other thing we can look at is the influence of Moon to Saturn, because we have to remember that Moon is an enemy to Saturn, and when Moon influences Saturn, Moon starves Saturn. So looking at the Rashi aspected planets table in the lower left-hand corner, we need to go over to the column with Saturn in the top row, and then we go down until we see where the Moon crosses, and we see that Saturn is being influenced by the Moon to 55 points. So that's an extremely strong aspect, since the cap is 60, which means that the Moon has a potential to severely starve Saturn. However, we have to see how powerful is the Moon to do that. So looking at the dignity table in the upper right-hand corner, we see that the Moon is in an enemy sign, which again means the Moon is asleep. And we see that Saturn is exalted, wide awake, which is similar to what we talked about before. The Moon is there, and the Moon is attempting to starve Saturn, but it can't do it, because Saturn is wide awake. So Saturn, again, sees the Moon, realizes that it's within his field of vision, so he's a little bit bothered. He's still a little bit focusing on his frailties, on his insecurities, but he's not going to fully identify with them because the Moon is not awake or even semi-conscious to keep reminding Saturn of his insecurities. So with this Lajjitaadi Avashtas, again, Saturn is not extremely harmed by the Moon because the Moon does not have the power to overcome Saturn because Saturn's in an exalted state.